Hello, welcome, and thank you for watching this webinar. This webinar is organized by The Forge and Nkrumah School in South Africa and is one of our contributions for the events planned for the Anti-Imperialist Week of Action, which starts from today to the 10th of this month. We thought to theme the webinar Imperialism and the Land Question. And we wanted to have a discussion about the multifaceted impact of imperialism in Africa, ranging from land dispossession to exploitation of indigenous people, and ultimately a disruption of life as people knew it. As a result of this, there was a perpetual loss and a perpetual cycle of poverty. By loss, we mean loss of land, we also mean loss of home. And so in many ways, the devaluation of the lives and labor of African people. And we want to also highlight the fact that in Africa, there's an interconnectedness between landlessness and poverty. And we also know that, and we acknowledge that imperialism has a variety of factors. In fact, I'm going to use Vijay Prashad's definition, who says that few countries built their wealth through colonialism and enslavement of human beings, built enormous militaries, and controlled international systems of trade and finance in order to plunder natural resources, exploit workers, and increase and consolidate profits and power. But we wanted to focus particularly on the land question, because as Patrick Tariq Millet says, when he frames the land question, particularly in South Africa, but we also think this is relevant to the African continent, that the real challenge is to restore the land and dignity of Africans. And I'm very happy today and delighted to be joined by three incredible panelists, three incredible contributors, three incredible comrades and activists whose work and lives is dedicated to taking seriously the lives of the poor and the working class and activism towards struggle that supports the struggle of the poor and the working class. And those are Busisiwe Diko, Mr. Siyabonga Sithole Yoneskedi Alosa. I'm going to start with introducing our speakers. Busisiwe Diko is the Interim Youth League Coordinator of Abahlali Basemjondolo Social Movement. She's the coordinator of the Sub-Saharan Africa and International People's Assembly Youth Committee. Busisiwe is a student and an activist. Mr. Siyabonga Sithole is a land activist and the programs manager at the Association for Rural Advancement, or AFRA, and his key areas of knowledge and advocacy include the rights of people living on commercial farms that they do not own. These include farm workers, labor tenants, and land claimants. Our third panelist is Yoneskedi Aloso, who is the director of Pan Africa Today. Yones also runs the Nkrumah School, a popular education project grounded in Pan-Africanism. Yones is also part of the Sub-Saharan African Anti-imperialist Week, Yones did an MA on popular politics in rural South Africa, the case study of the Retables. Welcome to all our panelists, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really delighted to be in conversation with you. So Yones, I'm going to start with you. And I'm going to start with the question of imperialism as it manifests itself. So what I want to know is that what are the current manifestations of imperialism, particularly in the African continent? And in what ways do they affect us? but I want you to more focus on the current manifestations of imperialism, particularly in the African continent.
Right, thank you, Yvonne, and thank you to everyone for having me. So on the how does imperialism manifest, and I was very happy that you started off with a definition of what imperialism in fact is. And I think it is important to start there in understanding what it is, and importantly, how it impacts us today. So the three key words that came out of the definition that you shared was plunder, exploitation, and profit. And if those are some of the key elements of what imperialism means today, then in reality, a lot of not only the Africa we see today, but also the Africa that has come to be created through exploitation, through colonialism, through slavery, is the Africa that is a victim of imperialism. And here it is necessary to perhaps spend 2 minutes going back to what is the history via which imperialism develops, because it wasn't always the case that we were living in a society dominated by an imperialist stage of capitalism. But what happens is, just as land is enclosed in England and people are sent off the land in order to force them into the capitalist economy, that process allows not for free competition, but rather for monopolies to be created. And it is those monopolies that then export that capital from the so-called core countries, such as England, France, Portugal, Spain, many of the countries that we know as colonial countries. It's the export of monopoly capital that then goes into the peripheral parts of the world in order to then exploit people there. So Cecil John Rhodes arrives in South Africa, at some stage owns Zimbabwe, known as Rhodesia, because he is able to take that monopoly capital, work together with a European state in order to subjugate the African continent. And it is in this process, and I know that we're going to be getting to this land question, that the process of enclosing land in South Africa in 1913 is about the creation of cheap African labor to then go into the South African mines not owned by South Africa, to exploit the people, to plunder the mineral resources, and to generate profits for core countries. And it is that process on which modern capitalism rests. So when Lenin wrote in the end of 1916 that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, this is precisely what he was not only reflecting on, but actually predicting in many ways. To say that the conditions we have today, where the United States of America has 46 military bases spread across the African continent, a mechanism via which they are able to use force and coercion to ensure that the African people do not become politically free, nor do they become economically free. And it is through this continued exploitation, plunder, violence, aggression that imperialism manifests itself. So in answering very briefly your question, the increasing militarization in many parts of the African continent. I mentioned the military bases. I mentioned the French presence in the Sahel region. I mentioned the fact that suddenly a few weeks ago, we are hearing of so-called Islamic fundamentalism in parts of Mozambique or Mali, and coincidentally, this is at the same time that gas resources are being discovered. So the wealth that the African continent has, the wealth that South Africa has, is wealth that, much as has been the case over the past 2 centuries, is something that many colonial powers are particularly interested in. And they're willing to use violence and force, either directly through colonialism or indirectly through neocolonialism, in order to ensure that the African people do not benefit from the wealth of this continent. And that, I would say, in a nutshell, is how imperialism manifests today on the African continent. And then I know that we're going to get into what that means in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you so much for that rich contribution, Jonas. And Siyabonga, I want to move to you now. Jonas talks about the history, but he talks about the effects and the impact of imperialism. And he talks about exploitation. And the way in which he talks about exploitation is that there's this perpetual cycle, right? And it has its roots in imperialism. And you work very closely with farm workers. And in many ways, many farm workers are working the land they do not own. And if the current trajectory doesn't change, they're working the land that they'll never own if we don't confront the systems and we don't struggle and we don't fight against the systems. And so you work with farm workers. I'm very interested to hear your views about this exploitation and the ways in which you understand it through the framing of the land question and how they, meaning the farm workers that you work with their everyday experiences. I know myself that, sometimes the typical day of a farm worker starts at 5 a.m. because they need to go to the milking station so that madam, no bus can have the fresh milk for their breakfast. And then the day continues until at about 5, 6 p.m. But throughout the day, there's consistent hard labor, but the remuneration does not reflect that. And so in many ways, farm workers are exploited in South Africa. And also the question of poverty as it relates to farm workers is fundamentally a question about landlessness. So I'm interested to hear your views on this.
Thank you, Yvonne. Maybe let me start by agreeing with Jonas here. And it's important that we go back and understand the definition of or the history of imperialism. Because with all that is said, I just want to add a couple of words that it's a purposeful, intended, orchestrated action to subjugate. So these things don't happen by accident. And that's exactly what Jonas was talking about, that these are planned, orchestrated actions of taking advantage of people in areas where there is wealth or natural resources. So for me, when you draw me to think or talk about farm workers and the situation on farms, the situation on farms is sort of a microcosm of what is happening in the continent that we're discussing now, Africa. In that it's about power relations. It's about a perpetual intended action of keeping people powerless, keeping people in a place where they can be exploited.
Yeah.
And that is what has happened. And unfortunately, if you look at South Africa today, I've just recently in one of our meetings with a group of farm dwellers and farm workers, they termed themselves the forgotten citizens. In that, if you look at South Africa today, almost a generation after the advent of democracy, it is the one group in South Africa that remains in the same situation it was in before 1994. They even use a comparison to say everybody else in the country has 3 layers of government. You either go to your local municipality, the province, or national, but they have a 4th layer. They have what they term ulu. They have a farmer that controls everything on the land. That is their first government. So they have different to all citizens. They have this extra layer of governance, which is actually a good way of portraying the situation that people are in. At this day and age, there are people that still need permission to build the houses. In 2020, there are people who need permission to have visitors at home. In 2020, there are people who need permission to keep livestock. In 2020, there are people who need permission from one person. There could be 100 families on the farm, but they need to ask one person just to have a traditional ceremony, maybe something to do with their ancestors. That tells you that, and government has done nothing about this. Government has continued to enact legislation that entrenches this unequal, what do you call it, like a master-servant relationship that persists on farm. And as you say, our governing party is hailed for promoting the principles of the Freedom Charter. And one of the most famous ones was that the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. So who else should be at the forefront of legislation and policy? Should it not be people living on and working the land, which is farm workers? But we don't see that. 2020, we are still seeing farm workers in a situation where they seem to be living pre-1994.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Sia. I actually also like your analysis, and you use the term in relation to the farm workers and the employer, or the farm owner in this case. And you say that it's a master-servant relationship. I mean, that's a very loaded statement, and it's very rich. And I think it's important that we also look at it like that, because I know myself, living in the Eastern Cape, growing up on a farm, and also having family, in various farms in the Eastern Cape. They still, my father included, they still use the term king. So, but they use it in isiXhosa, they say Nkosi or Bas. And these terms are used interchangeably. It's not about terminology, it's not about semantics, but the fact that they use the word king means they use it in the same way as they use the term Bas. And for me, that is less of an expression of the employer-employee relationship, but more of an expression of the relationship that the farmer has with the land as the farm owner, and as the owner of that particular territory. So I really love your use of the word master servant. So Busi, Jonas and Sia have talked about, the impact of colonialism, and have highlighted the importance of talking about these things and historicizing them, right? So we talk about the current context, but it's also important to historicize it, to expose the brutality of the systems, right? And how deeply entrenched these systems are in our societies, and how we need to continue the fight, right? But I want to also now move on to you, right? And I want you to also contribute to this discussion that Lucia has started, right? About the impact, right, of landlessness on the poor. And I'd like to get your reading of what the impact of landlessness on the poor is from your experiences.
Well, comrades, let me first agree with Comrade Stolle and Comrade Eunice, because I understand that imperialism on its own is a manifestation, because it's a balance of power, and in the process which nations try to achieve favorably in change. And then its purpose now is to decrease the strategic and political vulnerability to the nation. And then the impact of the landlessness is the main causes of poverty amongst indigenous people, especially in Africa. And indigenous people throughout the world have been displaced from their traditional land as a result of settler colonization, corporate imperialism, warlogging and mining, and even land conservation efforts, which has resulted in increased their social marginalization, especially the people that were the owners of the land before. So lack of access to basic and social services and chronic poverty. Of course, the condition of landlessness in South Africa is also one of the impoverishment, being without the capital to meet our basic needs. I mean, land is a basic need to us as South Africans. So, a necessity to know the land to grow our own food, keep animals, or sustain ourselves. So, landlessness again is affecting most colonies. Under foreign rules, native culture and industry are destroyed. Colonies are used as sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured food. Colonial power heads back the colonies from developing industries, and this results in hunger and desperation to many people. And again, the current manifestation of imperialism, now I'm just adding, the current manifestation of imperialism now is forcing on economic imperialism as now approaching to fourth industrial revolution, and technology is taking over to the jobs of many people. Technology is going to take over. If you are not well or technological advanced, we are going to suffer from poverty. If you do not own any land, you are going to suffer from poverty as we are approaching to fourth industrial revolution. So with substitution of labor force, now labor is not profitable to them, as there are so many people engaging in business sector that promote independence in indigenous people. Also a big competition among them as multinational companies coming in numbers, especially from China now. Their system does not serve what behind relocating from their countries or to our continent to cheap labor and people. They are now organizing against expropriation. So by introducing fourth industrial revolution, it will benefit them, not us, so much that bridges the gap of competition, because it's not about us, but it's all about them. It's about the people who are expropriating us. It's about the people who are using us in our own land. It's about the people who are taking power and who are taking control in making profit using our own land or the land of our forefathers. So I thank you for now.
Wow, that's a very rich analysis, Busi. Thank you for that. And I like the way that you link, capitalism to all of these things, and you use the term economic imperialism. But I also love the way that you talk about land as a basic need. And you talk about land as a form of sustenance, right? But you also talk about these systems as destructive. And I think that's a really rich analysis. I'm going to, Busi has, said so many things. And I'm going to give the opportunity to Jonas and Sia if they want to add anything, if they want to respond to Busi in any way.
So sure. Perhaps one or two comments, because I think I agree. I think she's gotten to the core of the issue here, because I think you also, again, in your introductory remarks, made the comment that this is about restoring land and restoring dignity.
Yes.
But this question of dignity, and it's incidental, I mean, Comrade Busi is from an organization. Two of the three aspects of its slogan have to do with land and dignity. But that dignity is about the dignity not only to have a title deed in a capitalist sense of a piece of land that you now own. It's about being able to reproduce your family, about being able to ensure that your child and your family as a whole is able to go to school, is able to live a dignified life. And here I think it is important to understand land not as a commodity, but as a part of what it is that we need in order to survive. Human beings have spent centuries applying their labor to land in order to be able to produce the next generation of human beings. Sadly, and this is again, she gets to the core of the issue, that the fact is, this is not about us who are applying our labor to the land. It's about the people who benefit from the fact that we apply labor to land. It's about the fact that this bus gets the milk without having to get out of bed in the morning. This is the root of the issue. And I think one of the things we need to insist upon is that we deal with the question of restoring dignity, restoring land, with putting an end to exploitation. And the second point that I think is important is that this putting an end to exploitation is not only the exploitation that happens on commercial farms, which of course, as we know, and perhaps as Sia will know better than most of us, is something that we cannot delay any longer. But we also need to understand this land question as a question of wealth, as a question of who owns the capacity, who owns the wealth, who owns the ability to generate wealth. Because the reason why, when there's a really beautiful book that I think everyone should read, sadly, but it does illustrate this land question. Saul Plaatje wrote a book more than 100 years ago about the Native Land Act of 1913. And I think it's the opening line where he says, waking up, and I think it's the 20th of July, 1913, the native found himself a pariah, not a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. It's a really, and sadly, the natives in South Africa remain pariahs in their land, in the land of their birth, whether it is in the shack settlements of KwaZulu-Natal or the farms of the Western Cape. But the purpose of that exercise was in order to force men into the mines and dig up gold to the extent where the majority of the gold that now exists above the ground in the world comes out of mines in South Africa. So the tremendous wealth that has been extracted from the South African land, which really belongs to the South African people and should have been used to ensure that we are going to school and that we have food and that we have the ability to reproduce ourselves, sadly, through imperialism, through colonization, through continued neoliberal policies today in a period where we claim to be beyond colonization and imperialism. Through these mechanisms, we continue to be in an environment where COVID-19 comes along and illustrates to us the fundamental inabilities of neoliberalism, of capitalism, to address the problems that humanity is confronted by. Half the people in the last 6 months, half the people that had a job a year ago are going to be unemployed now. We are looking at an environment where levels of hunger have increased exponentially across the world. And this takes us back to the question of what do human beings need in order to survive? 80% of land in South Africa is owned by white commercial farmers who aren't even commercial farmers, just fenced it off and told us to get out of the land. They're not actually producing food on there. So this question of what is the nature of this land question and how do we restore dignity? I think we have to shy away from a tendency that says it has to do with getting title deeds. It has to do with fundamentally upturning the exploitation that everyone today has referenced. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jonas. Thank you. Excellent analysis. Sia, can I have your views on this?
Yeah, sure. I'm largely covered by this. When Musi spoke, what really stood out for me, and I really wanted to comment on, which Jonas has touched on, is this dignity that we're talking about. Any struggle in the history of the African continent has largely been about dignity. It has been about reversing these effects of what we're talking about, of people of their homes. And for me, there can't be any dignity without a home. And when I say a home, I don't mean that in the obvious sense as in a house and so on. I mean it in that South Africa is a home, the indigenous people to South Africa. And as Busi was talking, that picture came to my mind, that where is home? Who is the visitor and who is at home? And unfortunately, colonization and apartheid has stripped that feeling, that safe feeling of being at home in this country for the majority of this country, which is Black people. And in that way, having said earlier that imperialism or colonization were purposeful actions, it's a pity that in what we are doing now, trying to address it, we're not being very purposeful. We're not being intentional. We are dealing with it, trying to find nice, friendly ways to deal with the situation where nobody gets hurt, and somehow we'll wake up tomorrow in South Africa, everybody will be happy, which is not possible. And the quote from Saul Plaatje that Jonas referred to talks to that we woke up to a place which was home, and suddenly we are the scum of the place. And we cannot reverse that without being even more intentional and more purposeful than the colonizer was. So for me, it's about that. The dignity is everything in this. And people will never have dignity living in poverty if this land hunger continues. there are certain guarantees that are given by the Constitution, our world famous Constitution, that talks about shelter and dignity and so on. Those things can only be dreams if people are still living in the abject poverty that they're living in, where they live on land they do not own, where they live on land in such an insecure way where they could be evicted at any time. How do you build a life? How do you build a future when you don't have anything? When you don't have a place where you're going to build your future on? And that's the problem for me.
Okay. So Sia is then moving us now to the next question, really. And I'm going to ask for your responses as well, but I'm going to direct the question to Busi and then to Jonas, and then we'll get back to you again. So you talk about intentionality. So what are our intentions? What are we doing to address these issues? And one of my questions, this is also one of my difficulties when you know, battling with this question, right? And for me, one of my, it's not really a fascination because I've lived through it, but one of my frustrations is that I often find myself asking the question, how is it 4 generations later that my family is still telling me stories in the same mud house that my great-grandfather built? How is it that, you know, I'm living this life, you know? How is it that I get told, right, about how much work my great-grandparents used to do on that farm? But I look at the life that my parents live, and I look at the life that I'm experiencing, and really, I get really frustrated because, you know, I see 2 things happening in parallel here. That for the farm workers, there's this perpetual cycle of generational poverty, while on the other hand, you know, there's generational wealth, you know, for the white farm owners, right? I don't think, you know, in this conversation we should run away from how land is distributed, right? And how that really, you know, speaks to the racial question, right? But also, as we do that, we also acknowledge that, you know, there's an elite capture of the land, and also the narrative that drives the conversation around the land question, right? So, you know, people tell us, you know, what land reform is going to look like, right? But we have yet to see the benefits of this land reform for the poor, right? And in many ways, you know, if you look at what is happening and this idea of elite capture and how land reform or the land reform program is being enacted by the government, really there are 2 things at play here. There's an interplay, right? And so there's a hangover of what Jonas is talking about, that, you know, the Native Land Act of 1913, because what you really are seeing is that part of the effects, particularly when it comes to the experiences of generations of farm workers, right? They live there for generations, and there's a reason for that. And I love how Jonas is saying that this is not just about real estate. This is not just about title deeds, but it's also about belonging. It's about what Sia's talking about home, and we don't relate to land in the same ways that capitalism does, right? And so part of the reasons why Black people in South Africa live on those farms for many generations, you know, under, you know, extreme exploitation, is because of that link between the living and those who have passed on, right? So they want that access to ancestral land. And so when you then are carrying out this program of land reform, and there's an interplay between reform and evictions, then there's a problem. Then there's a hangover, right, of what Jonas alluded to the 1913 Act, right? So I really love, Jonas, when he talks about the idea that it's not just about title deeds. In fact, all of us are making that argument that it's more, right, than about title deeds, right? And capitalism makes it about money. Capitalism makes it about real estate. And we're trying to have a conversation today that says, no, it's about way more, right? And so to move then to the next question, Busi, is when Sia talks about this idea of intentionality, how then do we ensure that our struggles against landlessness are impactful?
Okay, well, firstly, the people that are living in the villages and in the informal settlements and in the rural areas, they depend on land. Firstly, they depend on land. How? Because without land, they cannot practice agriculture. Without land, they cannot sustain their living conditions. Then it can be impactful if they can fight again for their land, because lack of effective government policies today and colonial legacies, a rapid population growth and poor productivity in agriculture are also the effects of landlessness. So it can be impactful if people can raise their voice and fight for their land and make their government understand that it is not about certain individuals or the big investors that own hectares of land that should benefit from their land. So it can be impactful that our government can understand the fact that 95% of our basic needs, such as food, water, food, clothing, depends on land. And the land that the government officials and those investors are privatizing does not belong to certain individuals, but then it belongs to the people. So I think it can be impactful if people can really fight for the land that they are owning. And many people from the working class, before they owned hectares of land, but what makes them poor today if they owned the hectares of land before? It is because the imperialists are taking over and they are taking their land. They are making them slaves on their land, and then they make profit on their land, and then after the people who used to own the land are now the slaves in that land. So it's so sad that people do not see this issue of land, that it is going to suffer many people from poverty. And then it can be impactful if our people or the black people who used to own the land before can know the betterment or can fight, if they can fight for their land, then that can achieve the betterment of the living conditions of the people in the informal settlement and in rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Busi, for that. Jonas, your responses?
No, I think this is a very important question, because it's good to analyze, it's good to understand, that's the first step, but ultimately the task is to change it, change the world, change the conditions of oppression. I think on your question about what would land reform look like, the question of how do we make sure that we are intentional and impactful, I think there are 2 points we need to remember about how it is that we got here. What did imperialism do to get us to this point? The process via which the dispossession of land took place, the establishment of capitalism, was an extremely violent process. We cannot deny the fact that it was through blood that mines were built in South Africa, that the colonial project was able to expand. And this is not a question of South Africa. Internationally, imperialism is exceptionally violent. Imperialist wars from Iraq to Afghanistan, to what is being attempted by suffocating Venezuela today, to a coup in Bolivia, and then, so there's no shortage of examples of how when imperialism moves, it moves extremely violently. So this is, I think, the first point we need to bear in mind, that we didn't get here through negotiation. We got here through violence, through force, and through bloodshed. The second point to remember is that there's a tendency still rife today to try and create artificial divisions that don't exist in order to secure the sustainability of an imperialist project of extreme exploitation. False divisions are created between men and women, between people who are unemployed and hungry in rural areas and people who are unemployed and hungry in urban areas. These divisions are created with an intention of ensuring that ultimately the unification of people in struggle is something that is avoided by the capitalists, by the imperialists. So on your question of how to be impactful, I think there's one important point that Comrade Sia will have raised in the earlier inputs around this intentionality, around the impact, and I think you might have used the word. This is a question of struggle. The answering the land question, resolving it, securing dignity is not something that anyone will hand to us. It's not something that will be negotiated. It is something that we need to struggle for. Now, there are multiple platforms and avenues of struggle. Part of it has to do with insisting on saying, if our constitution says I have the right to dignity, then I want my dignity. That's one aspect of the struggle. But one aspect is also of what our comrades in Abahlali are saying, that we have a right to the city. We will not be banished to the peripheries in order to not be able to sustain our lives. Similarly, the struggle that people on farms are having for not always land, struggle to have a proper school to send their children to have running water in their houses, to not be evicted. These kinds of struggles are very important ones, and that is the mechanism via which we need to understand that we are able to move forward. But I think in conclusion, I think there are three things we need to remember that will be elements of what the way forward is. One is a recognition that this is not going to be handed to us. The struggle against, or the struggle for dignity, which is a struggle for land, but it's also a struggle to not be exploited in any other way. We don't just want a plot of land and then continue to go and work for someone in the mines or in whatever company we are working and getting a pitiful salary. So a struggle for dignity is an ongoing struggle that requires unity between urban and rural, between men and women, between South Africans and non-South Africans. The struggle against imperialism is fundamentally a Pan-African struggle. It's an international struggle of the working class. So anyone, anywhere who is fighting against the manifestations of capitalism and imperialism is someone who is in struggle with us, even if we are separated by oceans. We are not separated in the sense that we are fighting for the same thing. And I think this last point that I want to make is to say that this is not something that has to be conjured up. It exists already. There are people who are struggling in their ways in order to secure a more dignified life for themselves and for generations to come. And not only for the dispossessed and humanity and the working class, but for all of humanity. The mechanism via which someone can drive through Sandton and not care about Alex on the other side of the road is something that is dehumanizing, not only towards the people of Alex, but also the people of Sandton. So the point that we need to unify our struggles and be in solidarity with one another and try and bring these together against what we have all on this call identified as the root of this problem, which has to do with using multiple creative ways to ensure that people can be exploited, that you can plunder natural resources, and that profits can be made. And that struggle, I think, is one that the task of anyone listening to this webinar, to ourselves, to the people who are already doing it, is about to try and unify those in a strategic way, in a way that will be impactful, as Sia will have said earlier. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jonas. I note the time. Maybe, Sia, this could be the closing remarks then. So the responses to these questions are going to then be the closing remarks to the webinar, unless someone has something else that they'd like to contribute after you. So we'll take you as the last speaker. And of course, if anyone wants to add anything after Sia has spoken, that can happen. So Sia, I'd also like your responses to particularly that issue of intentionality that you mentioned, right? I want you to speak more on that and you know, tell us what your idea of intentionality is in these struggles, but also more so, how do we ensure that as much as we are being intentional in the work that we're doing, but we're also being impactful.
Thank you, everyone. You know, I'm really moved by the analysis and the breakdown from Musi and Yonis, because it's awakening. You know, it's a reminder that the war is not over. It's a reminder that in 1994 a battle was won. It's a reminder that the war against colonization, against imperialism, is not over. And all you need to do to know that is to take a look outside your window, and the glaring inequality in this country is frightening. No matter which two groups you compare, people often like to use the term the haves and the have-nots, whether it's about race. If you look at, obviously we need to generalize when we speak about these things. It's not every black person who is the same. It's not every white person who's a farmer or who's a bad farmer at that, or a cruel farmer at that. But if you generalize and you look at black and white, you look at the employer, the employee, you look at landlords and tenants, you look at the farmer and the farm workers, landowners and occupiers, owners of land and claimants of that land. If you look at that, the inequality is striking. And unfortunately, we need to be frank and say that the systems that we have put in place have not worked. 25 years on, they have entrenched what we're trying to fight against. People are living, some even in a worse situation than they were 40 years ago. And we need to be honest about that. Situation, the current pandemic of COVID-19 is an example. It exposed what we had looked away and tried to forget about South Africa. Obviously, who was most impacted again? It's the poorest. Again, it's those people who are marginalized, who could not put food on the table. Some can't even, they continue to be in the situation. So for me, it's just reminding ourselves that the war is not over. Who the enemy is not important. The enemy is the poverty. The enemy is the corruption. It doesn't matter. You don't have to put the same face to the enemy all the time. We need to find the problem. And for me, moving forward, it's about having an inclusive, the impacted-led approach. Government needs to give the space to those that are impacted to lead their own struggle. It's about solidarity. It's about all of us in different spaces, whether it's Abahlali, whether it's Afra, no matter where you are in the country. It's about working in solidarity. It's about sharing resources to give the voiceless a voice, to give them a space to shout and be heard. It's about us challenging legal principles. It's about us challenging the law to push our constitution to give effect to what it intended to give effect to. It's about us holding government accountable. It's about us not being afraid to hold government to account. It's about us calling government to have a coordinated approach. We see tens of different departments working in silos trying to deliver services to people, which is obviously a problem. We need to push government to work in a coordinated fashion. We really need to work together on this. So for me, it's about asking questions, and those questions must be dealt with. Recently, one of beneficiaries of Afro Work asked me if South Africa will ever be able to afford to buy back the land that was stolen in South Africa. And I couldn't answer that question for two reasons. I'm not very good at maths. Two, I couldn't answer it because I started to think about who is financing the buyback of land through the current land reform program. If Black people are the majority in this country, and they're the majority of the workers, and they're the majority of the middle class, the majority of the poorest, the majority who pay VAT and so on, that means that is the money that is given to land affairs to go buy back the land for the benefits of Black people. And there is no way South Africa can be brought back in that fashion. So we need to mobilize and employ all mechanisms available to us. Let's not be afraid to talk about expropriation. When government built the N3 from Johannesburg to Durban, there were houses on the way that were expropriated for a reason. If the constitution says land reform is of public interest and you may expropriate for public interest, we need to test those things in court. We need to push government to say you cannot be held back, cannot be further delayed because those that own land refuse to be part of the game. They refuse to release the land. Willing buyer, willing seller. That can't be. We will wake up 50 years from now and the status quo will persist because we are understanding the law to be limiting and we're not wanting to push these legal principles and really fight for what this constitution intended to do. Thank you.
So much, comrades. This is a really lovely discussion. I know we're out of time, but something in me wants to ask Busi about Ekanana, right? Because part of what we need to do is to not just accept the terms that are given to us in terms of how those who are against our struggles want to define them as, right? Because there's always been this history, right? To write, the struggles of particularly the poor, right? And Black people, right? To criminalize them and also to, to demonize them. And the ways in which we do our work sometimes, or most of the time, requires us, to redefine, right, these terms and the ways in which we do our work. As Johannes has said, is a constant struggle, right? And I want to be careful how I phrase this, but part of our work is just to disrupt, the systems that make our work seem like they're criminal acts, right? That dehumanize us, that demonize us, right? And I want us to, as a way to close the conversation, please can you share with us what is happening at Ekanana?
Well, what is happening at Ekanana now is that, well, we have enough land. Firstly, we have enough land to plant vegetables and everything. But then at the same time, the municipality does not think that we have the right to that land. The municipality does not see the importance of using that land. The municipality does not care what we are doing in that municipality, in that land. And again, the people that are staying there are matured people, are people that do not want to get employed by anyone, are people that are practicing socialism. Well, I can say the people that are staying there are the people that are practicing socialism. We are not socialists yet. We are not socialists yet because we are living in a right-dominated society, and our country is ruled and controlled by the capitalist system. So again, the people that are staying there have got this passion of doing their own things by their own hands, except being employed by any company or except being employed by anyone. Why? Because we want to bring down this capitalist system of employing people in their land and give them low wages. Because we cannot survive. We cannot survive if we are not using our land. I, as an individual, I believe that land is a basic need. It's a basic need, and then we cannot live without land. So if I can plant spinach, if I can plant cabbage, there is no way I can go to any shop and buy those vegetables. And then again, the municipality does not like the fact that we have this idea of practicing agriculture, of improving our lives, of putting food in our tables using that land, because at first that land was not used by anyone. So the municipalities are taking us now because we are using that land and we have the idea on how we are going to use that land. But then at the moment we do not have enough fertilizers to practice agriculture, although we have already started. But then there is this problem of the municipality. Everything is okay now, but then there is this problem of the municipality and what councillors. They want to use us. They want to use the members of that branch as information resource centers. We cannot be information resource centers. We cannot be slaves. We refuse to be slaves in our own land. That is why the municipality now is having a problem with us. So we do not have a problem with the municipality, but then the problem that we have is that we refuse to be slaves in our own land, and then we refuse we refuse the fact that our land is going to be privatized by certain few individuals from the companies that we do not even know. So that is it for now.
Well, thank you so much, comrades. This was a really rich discussion. I really wish we had more time, but unfortunately we don't. May we continue to be in conversation, may we continue to be in solidarity, in our struggles, may we continue to be there for one another. As they say, Makwande, Pambili. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.